Good evening everyone, can we all hear me all right at the back?
Yeah.
Good, alright. So this evening I'm going to take you through half an hour of stories of symbiosis, and we're going to start that quite obviously with what exactly it is. So our story begins in the 1800s with this man, Heinrich Anton de Bary. Now de Bary was a particularly prevalent botanist and mycologist operating during the 1800s. He made lots of advances in terms of the study of plants and fungi that are still relevant in today's study of biology. Now, de Bary was particularly interested in lichens that we see all over the country, all over our trees, rocks, buildings, just about everywhere you can imagine. Now, for many years prior to de Bary's time as a scientist, what exactly lichens were was hotly debated. There were some people that believed they were fungi, and some people that believed that they were plants. Now, in modern times, what we can do is take a look at what's what. So what I want you to imagine is taking a slice, taking this 2D, cut through a lichen, and then under a microscope, taking a slice through it and looking at the side on under an incredible magnification down to the cellular level. And now when it's quite clear, you can see through this lichen these two distinct cell types. They've been taken in with a different type of stain here. You have the blue cells, these long, thin filaments surrounding up at the upper surface of the lichen, the bit that would be exposed to the air, these pink globular cells. Now if we take this and put it into a simple, crude diagram, we have green cells in one colour and the blue cellular structure in the other colour. Now what a lichen actually is, that de Bary figured out, is two separate organisms entirely. The green cells are a series of plant cells, normally algae or something like cyanobacteria if it's not a plant. But normally it's plant-based algae that photosynthesizes just as any other normal plant would, and it's protected then by this blue fungal structure that allows it to sit on places on high, such as trees or rocks, as mentioned before. Now, so if we go back to the image from before then, you can see now we have these plants at the top of the structure in this fungal lattice. And it was de Bary's opinion then that these organisms could be benefiting each other. He hypothesized that the photosynthesis, the way that the plant produces its carbohydrates, its food resource, could then be shared with the fungi, and in return the plant might benefit from the fungi, and then it gets protection from the external environment, it gets a place up on high where it could get more sunlight than it might do on the ground, and it avoids competition from resources in the soil with other plant life. And he was the first to coin the term symbiosis as the living together of unlike organisms. Now, over the time that de Bary was alive, this definition has certainly changed a little bit, and exactly what symbiosis means has been subject to intense debate. And under its modern definition, we can consider it as any type of close and long-term biological interaction between two different biological organisms. And in the case of the lichen, what we have is a mutualism. This is where in this type of symbiosis, both of the organisms present in a relationship are benefiting each other. There's a direct reward of the relationship to both species, but as we know now, this is not the only type of symbiosis, although it certainly was the definition for quite a long time. There is also commensalism, and there is parasitism, terms that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but just in case not, we'll go through each one individually. I want you to imagine two species in your mind, species A and species B. In mutualism, as I said, both species benefit from the symbiotic interaction. In commensalism, the first species benefits, but with no obvious cost or benefit to the second species. Commensalism is very rare, and normally the benefit or cost of the species is so discrete that perhaps we don't know it for now. So for the sake of this and for the sake of time, we'll ignore commensalism for the rest of this short 25 minutes. And then there is parasitism. This is where the first species has directly evolved to exploit another species and steal its resources from this second species. So now what I'd like to do is, in the time I have left, is take you through some stories of symbiosis, going through these two extremes of symbiosis one at a time. And we'll start with parasitism. So I'll just grab a bit of water, I'll give you time to take that in. Okay. So, to understand how parasitism first evolved, we have to understand how life goes through the evolutionary process in general. So we work under the assumption then that life is inherently selfish. We have individuals that are competing for resources in the external environment in which they live to reproduce and survive better than other members of its own species, and at the species level to reproduce and survive better than other species. So when we have populations of animals in the environment that will vary between species and individuals, they are exposed to what's known as selection pressures. These are individual aspects of their environment that select for certain traits. So in this original population of 7 individuals at the top, let's say that those 7 blue blobs are giraffes. And the darker red individuals, let's say they have longer necks than all of the other individuals in the population. Now in their environment, let's say there are a load of high trees and the resources, the best resources, are only available from the very top of these trees. Therefore the giraffes with the longer necks are selected to survive better and reproduce more than individuals with shorter necks. After time they survive and reproduce better, and the genes that code for those traits increase with prevalence in the population until all of the giraffes are tall. This is what we call natural selection, and this forms the backbone of the evolutionary process. So then we've covered now that individuals are selected to best exploit the resources in their environment. And as we mentioned in symbiotic parasitism, simply one species becomes this resource. So in the evolution of parasitism, what we have is a species opportunistically having the opportunity to exploit a new resource to benefit its survival, and this resource is a species. So let's then go through real examples to understand this properly. Those of you that might remember my 10-minute talk from back in December 2017 will be familiar with this. This is the gastrointestinal nematode worm, Wombourne contortus. Wombourne contortus is normally found in the gut of ruminant animals such as sheep, cattle, deer, goats, things such as that, where it burrows into the intestinal lining of these animals to consume blood, gut lining, get all of its resources that it needs to survive and reproduce from its host. Now, nematode worms are an incredibly complex group that exists all over the world. It's a well-known quote, actually, that if we deleted the entire planet and everything on it other than nematode worms, the outline of the Earth would be left behind from things such as buildings to animals to oceans and mountains. You would be able to still see them when the nematode worms that are left behind. They are really everywhere. And when they live in this external environment, not all nematode worms are parasitic, in fact most of them just have a very simple life cycle where they they absorb resources from the soil that surrounds them. And they go through this simple life cycle from adults to egg through numerous larval stages to become adults again. So let's imagine a scenario then where these animals might have the option to evolve parasitism. With the evolution of terrestrial life, in the case of these large grazing mammals, as I mentioned before, there is opportunity now where something is directly feeding from the environment in which these nematode worms find themselves, in the soil or on pasture. And let's say by chance then that nematode worms are taken up by these animals and pass through their bodies. Immediately there's a selection pressure here, in that nematode worms that don't survive this process will be removed, and exclusively nematode worms that can survive the internal digestive process of a ruminant mammal will suddenly find themselves in a place that they haven't experienced before. And immediately then, if a nematode worm can survive in these conditions, it gains a massive benefit over other nematode worms living in the soil, and that is the increased reproduction that's offered due to the distance that a mammal travels over its lifetime. Is impossible to imagine for a nematode worm that's the size of, impossible to see without a microscope, or it's at least certainly difficult to be able to distribute its eggs over such a large distance, to be exposed to new environments, new mating partners, is a huge benefit. So immediately then, now we have selection on the adult nematodes to be able to exploit this host resource for as long as it can. And this is where parasitism comes in. Some of the first gastrointestinal nematode parasitism is thought to have been quite passive, where just as it absorbs its nutrients from the soil through its body, it absorbs the nutrients available in the animal's gut from its digested meal, and just steals the resources that the host has eaten. And then over time we have more active parasitism that might offer an increased benefit in the case of burrowing into the gut lining to steal from the host tissue. So what then I want to emphasise here is that we have the opportunity to exploit a novel resource that really isn't any different from a non-living resource to best increase the survival and reproduction of the individual. This is how parasitism evolves. So how about another example then? Those of you that are fans of plants or Christmas will recognise this as mistletoe. Now, mistletoe is a parasitic plant that feeds off of other plants. And if we imagine then a similar opportunity, where if millions and millions of years ago, a mistletoe seed or spore in the case of other plants, was able to embed itself, germinate in a tree or another plant life form, spread its roots into its body and sack resources from it, then it no longer has to compete with other plants in the soil for these resources such as water and nutrients. So it's the removal of this competition to find a new opportunity to increase the survival and reproduction of its organism. So that's the basic concept here. How about then some real interesting stories of symbiosis? What happens when we have this basic concept and have some adaptations to sustain this relationship over long periods of time? What we have here is the larval form of a barnacle. Now, when we think of barnacles normally, we think of these things that line the hulls of ships and the rocks around our coastlines. But actually, this barnacle, which is known as Saculina, looks more like this. Now, the actual barnacle here is this yellow amorphous blob that we see here in this overall structure. And what this overall structure actually is a green crab. Saculina, the barnacle Saculina, is a parasite of a number of crab species. And what we see here is the externa of the animal. If we were to have an X-ray view through this crab, you would see what's called the interna of the Saculina barnacle, which is a series of barnacle tentacles that puncture their way through the crab's flesh, literally wrap themselves around the organs of the crab and sack it of nutrients, suck out everything that it can to further its own survival. So that's again the basic concept that we have here. So what's the interesting story of symbiosis? This female green crab here in question, the Saculina occupies the space that normally would live the egg sac of these animals when it's time for them to reproduce. And you would think the green crab would recognise this. It would say, hold on, I'm not pregnant, something's trying to hijack my resources, something's trying to steal from me, I'm going to do something about it with these claws and legs that I have. So Saculina has evolved a way around this. What it does, when growing and infecting the host for the first time, begins to pump the female crab full of hormones, and the crab starts to believe that it's pregnant. The hormones completely change the brain chemistry inside this animal, and it truly believes that this parasite is an egg sac. Now, when the female Saculina has mated with a male Saculina barnacle that's free swimming in the water, it will itself produce its own offspring, and then it will send a message to the crab's brain to say, okay, it's time to reproduce now. It's time to take advantage, let me hijack the crab's biology to release my eggs out into the world. So the crab will find itself in an area of moving water currents, where normally it would go to release its own eggs, and it begins to stridulate its body to pump water through, blasting out Saculina's larval stages into the currents around, just as it would do with normally its own offspring. So we have this total, really, taking over of the crab's physiology and reproductive cycle for the parasite's own benefit to sustain this parasitic relationship. What happens then if the crab is male? What happens if a Saculina runs into a male crab? Surely this behavioural modification wouldn't work. Well, it's actually a lot more complicated. Much again, the Saculina begins absolutely pumping the male crab full of hormones, and it begins to change. Its body widens and flattens to become morphologically much like that of a female, and its behaviour changes to the point that it begins exhibiting female courtship dances to appeal to other males. Now, once again, when Saculina it's time for it to reproduce, it sends a messages to the crab's brain, and it believes it's a female now that's capable of pregnancy. And it goes through the same process of stridulating into a nice moving current to release the Saculina's offspring on its behalf. Total hijacking of the crab biology. How about another example then? These brown, yellowy brown structures here, once upon a time were caterpillars. And these woody looking structures to the top are a particularly famous fungus known as cordyceps. What cordyceps does is when its spores find their way onto the body of an insect, such as a caterpillar, it begins to grow, and through the spiracles of the organism, its ventilation system punches its way into the insect's body, completely takes it over, and after draining it dry of resources, bursts out the head of the organism as a reproductive fruiting body to pass its spores on into the wind and continue the cycle again. So once again we have this basic concept of a novel method of exploiting resources from something and avoiding competition with other fungi in the external environment for resources. So what's the complex story of symbiosis here? This is an ant that's unfortunately succumbed to the cordyceps parasite, a particularly nasty way to die. But what you'll notice here is this ant is biting down as hard as it can forever on the edge of a leaf here. And a few days prior, when it was first infected with cordyceps, it behaviourally would have begun to change. It would have started ignoring the needs of its colony and began climbing. It would have found the nearest tree, climbed and climbed and climbed until the cordyceps told it was time to stop, at which point it finds the nearest leaf and bites down hard. Here, knowing that cordyceps has a chance with much more ventilation, circulating air currents than it would find at the surface, it bursts out of the ant and releases its spores. Much like the Saculina, although being so far removed, these two species aren't distinct otherwise, we see here this exact same hijacking of the host's biology to sustain this parasitism through increasing the survival and reproduction benefits available to it. So I hope through then the story of symbiosis, in this case parasitism, you can see how these wacky adaptations evolve. So then, how about mutualism? Mutualism is particularly interesting because, as we've established, life is normally inherently selfish. So, as we stated before, this is when two species benefit each other through the symbiotic relationship. But if life is selfish, then surely all individuals are constantly selected to look after themselves. Surely it would take some really unique circumstances for a situation to arise where two species can benefit each other in this relationship without the relationship falling apart completely. So how we have to see it then is as biological bartering. Individual species are selfish and they do have their own interests, and it's often a trade-off between costs and benefits that will allow these mutualisms, this symbiosis, to arise. So if you take a look at an example, any flowering plant, any angiosperm, any plant that produces flowers and pollen to fertilise other plants, needs to fertilise as many plants as it can to further its own reproduction and survival in generations to come. Now, the most basal way that it can do this is by the wind. But of course, this has the downside that you have to produce an immense amount of pollen to do this. It's very costly for the plant, and even then, if there's no wind at all, or if the wind is in a bad direction on a certain day, there's no real guarantee that any pollen you're releasing will actually go on to produce you offspring. So from the plant's perspective, what it needs is a more reliable way to reproduce and reduce the amount of investment that it's putting into reproduction. So is there any other species that can benefit this? Of course there is. Insects are hungry. Insects need food, and there is an opportunity for the plant to offer this in exchange for a service. Now, flowering plants offer their nectar. This is, of course, very costly for them. The sugar that it takes to offer this food to the insect certainly costs it a good amount of resources. But the benefit that it gains through an insect visiting it, picking up its pollen, and then going on to carry this pollen non-randomly to another plant, almost guaranteeing or vastly increasing the reproductive probability, is worth it to the plant for the reduced cost of reproduction. Likewise to the bee, it doesn't mind picking up a little bit of pollen. Certainly that little bit of extra weight might cost it the most minuscule amount of energy flying around, but it's got a guaranteed food source then. This mutualism has arisen due to the trading of resources because the costs to each species are lower than the benefits gained by the relationship. And then when this relationship is in place, species can co-evolve together to the point where these systems are relatively locked in place. Then we'll get to that in a minute. How about another example then? This on the left is a cleaner wrasse, fish found very commonly around the coral reefs of the world. And on the right-hand side here, we see a crustacean and ectoparasite. There are many, many different genuses and species that normally live on the surface of much larger fish, where they pick away at the scales and the mucus of these fish for their own survival, this type of parasitism, and in turn damage the fish host. Now, for the larger fish, it doesn't like this at all. Certainly, it doesn't like having its scales and flesh picked at. And not only this then, this damage runs the risk of increased disease risk. Certainly by breaking into the fish's protective layer, it's having a real cost on it. From the cleaner wrasse's perspective, it needs a meal. It needs this way to exploit a new resource that it might not have competed for before. In evolutionary terms, there's an option for both of these species to benefit from each other. And that's exactly what happens. These larger fish visit the cleaning stations on the reefs of these animals, the cleaner wrasse will eat the ectoparasites off of their body, and in return these larger fish that are very capable of eating the cleaner wrasse as a lovely snack do not eat the cleaner wrasse. And this is because, from the larger fish's perspective, the benefit that it gains from not eating the cleaner wrasse through the removal of these ectoparasites is far greater than the nutritional value that one tiny cleaner wrasse would give. And from the cleaner wrasse's perspective, it gets a free meal. There's no real cost to it there. This mutualism is able to develop. Are these perfect, though? If life is so selfish, surely there's constant selection for the maximum exploitation of these resources, and we would expect them to break down. Is this the case in the cleaner wrasse then, if we take a look at this example? And often actually this does occur in particularly stressful situations when cleaner wrasse already find themselves hungry and desperate. They would much rather pick away, just like the ectoparasites do, at the flesh and the mucus on the external parts of these larger fish. It's much more nutritious for them than the parasites are, and so when times are tough, they are selected to do this. Of course, now the larger fish doesn't like being cheated. This is very bad for it. It's here to get a service, and to be betrayed like this obviously isn't ideal. So is there then some way to sustain the mutualism? And this was investigated in a laboratory experiment quite a few years ago now, where a cleaner wrasse was put into a tank and offered two different foods. One was defined as the good food and the other as the bad food. When the cleaner wrasse ate the good food, they were allowed to keep both resources, but when the cleaner wrasse visited the bad food for a snack, both A and B were removed from the tank and the fish was left with nothing. And what this replicates is in real life, where the larger fish is betrayed by the cleaner wrasse, it simply will remember and not visit this cleaning station anymore in future. The mutualism breaks down temporarily, but then of course neither species is benefiting. The larger fish still has parasites if there are no other cleaner wrasse for it to visit, and the cleaner wrasse has now had its free meal removed completely. So both are in trouble. So in the tank scenario, what actually happened then was, after a period of time of learning from this removal of the food, even when both the good food and the bad food were offered to the cleaner wrasse in the tank, the cleaner wrasse only took the good food. Through punishment, the mutualism was forced to be sustained because the cleaner wrasse had no other option. The option of taking, there is this drive for the cleaner wrasse to lapse into parasitism and steal from its host. But instead, the host has the option of punishing the cleaner wrasse, removing this resource. Now, there's nothing for it to do. Punishment then can sustain this mutualism in a selfish world. And these mechanisms of maintaining this symbiosis exist to go against the mechanisms that drive this individual thinking. Is this always the case? Certainly not. There's certainly examples where mutualism has existed in the past, but the costs of this cheating might not have been strong enough to stop this selfish pressure from causing the mutualism to lapse into parasitism. What we have here is a bee species that's developed this stylet-like structure to puncture the flower at the base and completely rob the flower of all of its nectar resources, without providing any pollination benefit to the flower by visiting to take its fair share of nectar. There's been no punishment from the plant in this case for a variety of reasons, and this mutualism has been allowed to collapse completely through this adaptation for selfish behaviour. And this is possible also in the pollination mutualism from the other perspective. This particularly charismatic looking plant is a bee orchid. Now, it doesn't look it to us, or perhaps it might, but to a male bee, what this looks like is a very sexually suggestive female that says, "I'm available, come and visit me." And that's exactly what happens. The male bee is tricked into copulating, into mating with this flower, and in doing so, receiving no nectar reward, it's covered in the pollen of the plant, and then will go on to fly about and see another suggestive-looking bee orchid and be like, "Oh, I'll give that a go." And in doing so, pollinates these flowers for it. Through the plant's selection to be selfish, it again has lost this pollination mutualism. It's broken down completely. So mutualism then can only persist in this symbiotic relationship where the benefits of both species are strong enough and there's an ability to punish the selfish selection for cheating to maintain the mutualism over time and to stop it from breaking down. And now we'll look at one real interesting example of mutualism really quickly in the time that we have remaining. This is a fig wasp, a particularly charismatic looking insect with that huge head that's specifically developed for tunnelling its way into figs. Now figs and fig wasps have a symbiotic mutualism that's been 90 million years in the making in terms of co-evolution, adapting into each other, where the wasp is totally dependent on the fig for its entire life cycle, and in turn the fig is dependent on the wasp for its life cycle through the pollination that the wasp provides. Now, unlike a flower, the fig's flower is on the inside of the fruiting body. So that's our fig outer structure there, and this is a cross-section through the middle. You can see there a female fig wasp entering the fig through what's known as the ostiole. And in doing so, this wasp that looks just like this will go through an incredible amount of damage. It will lose a good amount of its limbs, its wings will be completely ripped from it, but this doesn't matter to the fig wasp because this is its last stand. Once inside the fig, at the start of its life cycle, that we'll get back to in a second, the female wasp was fertilised and also coated in the reproductive material, the pollen of the fig, to continue with it. So it gets inside the fig, fertilises the fig through the transfer of pollen, and in doing so lays its eggs into the fig's internal structure. Now 6 months to a year later, when the next season rolls around, the eggs begin to hatch. We have these then two very morphologically distinct male and female fig wasps. The female fig wasp juveniles look much like the adults because they are preparing to go off into the world. The male fig wasps, on the other hand, will spend their entire lives here, and it will be a very short life. In the short time that they're alive, they mate with the females that are also present in this fig. The females are fertilised, and then the male tunnels its way out of the fig, creating an opening for the females to escape into the outside world. The female juveniles have coated themselves in the pollen of the fig, and this cycle continues again after a brief time spent outside. And this goes on and on and on over many years. These life cycles are totally dependent on each other for their persistence. This is really, really locked in mutualism after years and years of co-evolution for the benefit of these two organisms, rather than compete for survival and resources and these chances of reproductive success that they might have to attain in the external environment. They've taken this benefit that they can gain with each other to guarantee their survival in generations to come. So surely then, a mutualism that's been locked in over all of these years isn't subject to this breakdown into parasitism. But of course, in the natural world, so selfish as it is, this isn't the case. This here is a line that's evolved from this mutualistic fig wasp, another fig wasp species that's developed this impressive ovipositor. Now, rather than entering the fig at the end of its life and offering this pollination to the fig, this female fig wasp has the benefit of being able to puncture individual figs, multiple individual figs, and deposit a few eggs into this one, into each one rather. The fig gains no benefit from this relationship. There's been a complete lapse into parasitism. Despite this incredibly complex mutualistic relationship, parasitism has still been allowed to occur due to the selfish selection on individuals for the mutualism to break down. So in these stories of symbiosis then, these selection pressures that act on these individuals to survive and reproduce as best they can arise in mutualism in certain circumstances, but also the constant selection for cheating, for maximum exploitation of individuals as a resource often lead to lapses into the parasitic world. So to finish off then, I'll leave you with one more story of symbiosis. What I want you to imagine these crude ovals as is two bacteria, and we're going back in time now, close to 1 billion years, where single-celled bacterial life ruled the world and was the only thing that lived there. Now these larger bacteria collect their food by absorbing particles from the external environment, and for the sake of time and simplicity, let's just say that by random chance over a number of years, by random chance at one point this smaller bacterium was taken into the larger one and wasn't digested and was allowed to persist. This is obviously a gross simplification, but is what the leading theory is what did happen a long time ago. Now, if we think back to this lichen example that we saw right at the start of this adventure, about half an hour ago, we have this exact same scenario again, where there's a symbiotic, mutualistic relationship going on by one partner in the relationship living inside the other. Much like the plant part of the lichen relationship, the smaller bacterium produces resources for the larger bacterium and is provided then a safe shelter to live in, safe from the external environment, by this larger bacterium. Now, what gets really interesting in this story of symbiosis is over a number of years and a complex mechanism, we think there was the exchange of DNA, where most of the smaller bacterium's DNA was sent over to its larger partner, and these two individuals became fixed. This adaptation, this mutualistic partnership became locked together completely. And what this smaller bacteria became was the first mitochondria. Now, mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells that through respiration produce all the energy that our cells need to function and for complex life in its forms that exist today and have existed for 500 odd million years to exist. This theory of how this came to be is known as symbiogenesis. The evolution of the most complex life on Earth developed through the story of mutualistic symbiosis and has allowed all of us to exist today and all complex life on Earth to exist today. So the real story of symbiosis that I want to leave you with is that you, all of you, me, every single human being on Earth and every animal that lives today, bacteria aside, is a story of symbiosis, because it would not exist without the driving of this mutualism and this symbiotic relationship over the scale of millions and millions of years. I hope that's interesting to you. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you, Ben. Fascinating stuff, eh? Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. So what we'll do is we'll have a quick break now for about 10-15 minutes, if that's okay. And then if we can reconvene at 9:15, and we'll have just a few questions and answers, if that's all right with you. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks again. Cheers.